The Patriot Act in the United States, reauthorized, would have expired at midnight last night. To tell us about it, we are joined by senior fellow from the Hudson Institute, Christopher Sands. He's with us from Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.
Hi, Theo.
Hi. Okay, so tell us what happened with this extension of the key provisions of the Patriot Act.
Well, as you know, most of the Patriot Act is settled law, but the Congress put 3 provisions under a sort of renewal requirement to make sure that they didn't become too comfortable for the government, to force the government to defend its use of these every so often and make Congress go on record saying, yes, we continue to approve them. The 3 provisions are a roving wiretap provision, a provision that allows for monitoring of various lone wolves that are out there, and access for the government to business records. To sort of walk through each of them in turn, the roving wiretaps was an attempt to deal with the fact that people have multiple cell phones. And the way U.S. law used to work, you'd get a wiretap for a particular phone line, say the home phone of an individual or the business phone. But each line had to be authorized. And so the Patriot Act allowed the government to ask for a wiretap of an individual. So if they had cell phones, including throwaway cell phones, they could be monitored under the same authorization if there was a reason that they could justify to the court that they were interested in this person and their activities. The second provision that comes up is this lone wolf provision, which is part of an intelligence act from 2004. So it's not technically part of the Patriot Act set, but gets renewed in the same cycle. This is going after individuals who have raised a flag for intelligence reasons. It allows the government to conduct surveillance of those individuals, even though they may not yet have committed a crime. It only works for non-American nationals. You can't go after U.S. citizens in this regard, but if there's somebody from a third country who's come to the U.S. that's kind of caught people's attention, it allows the government to seek a warrant to monitor or conduct surveillance of that individual for a period of time on suspicion of activity, even though no criminal activity has taken place. And the third provision on business records is one that raises some eyebrows, but it allows the government to subpoena business records like credit card records or hotel records or, for example, your Netflix records to find out what an individual may have been renting, what they may have been charging, what they may have been doing. These are private business records, and before 2001, before September 11, businesses worried about sharing that stuff with the government under the fear that individuals whose privacy was thus violated would then sue the government for giving away their records, or more importantly, sue the businesses, and they'd be criminally liable for sharing information with the government, which they're not obliged to do. What this does is it provides the businesses with some protection. If the government comes to them with a warrant, they can share the information and they're protected against being sued later for having given the information away. It essentially puts all the onus on the government to defend that, and then the business is basically neutral in all of this.
Okay. As you said, the Patriot Act itself passed in the wake of 9/11, passed, I think, unanimously out of the U.S. Senate at that time. Yeah. But, like a lot of legislation, not really read or comprehended by the people who voted for it. And there have been, in the 10 years since, almost 10 years, an awful lot of discussions about it. Now, you mentioned those 3 provisions that had to be renewed. That first one, I think, makes a lot of sense, because what self-respecting bad guy has a home phone anymore, right? You want to seriously, you want to have a wiretap on somebody. This isn't 1945 where can we get a tap on this line? You tap on a person. That I can be on board with. But something, sir, what continues to concern me is stuff like reauthorizing the Homeland Security Department, on which $360 billion has been spent, with almost no oversight, because they don't even report to congressional committees anymore. And then just saying, okay, we're just going to pass this thing right through to keep the Patriot Act going, these 3 provisions. One of them you can make sense, but the other 2 I think are certainly questionable. I just think it seems in the Congress on a bipartisan basis, people do basically anything if you tell them it's for Homeland Security or the Patriot Act. But I worry, sir, that these things don't get examined an awful lot. Do you think these extensions were examined properly by the Congress?
Well, it's interesting, because one of the things that has been getting some comment here is the government waited, or the Congress waited, until these provisions were supposed to expire at midnight yesterday. And they waited to the last possible moment, in part because Senator Rand Paul from Kentucky had held up the legislation. He wanted a more thorough debate about some of these provisions that you've mentioned. And so there was a lot of dilly-dallying, non-action at all in Congress until the deadline comes up. And they pass it, right up against the deadline with relatively limited debate because of the time pressure. And it's so last minute that the president, who's in Europe for the G8 summit, had to have it authorized to be signed by AutoPen, you know, one of those remote computers that imitates the president's signature. He had to write a letter of authorization so the AutoPen could be used, so it could be signed in Washington, even though he's in Europe, so that the provisions would not lapse at all. It's a bit of a comic, almost mockery of the law process, but this is where Congress is now. A lot of the votes are trivial and symbolic, like rejecting the president's budget, but not putting in a budget resolution of their own, as we saw earlier in this week. And then some of the votes that are really important are left to the last minute and then handled with minimal debate. So you raise a very good concern. I think a lot of people here are worried about this very question about how much debate is really going on.
Yeah, look, and like a lot of people, after 9/11, everyone's like, okay, we've got to do this, we've got to do that to make sure this doesn't happen again. And I mentioned the Department of Homeland Security. You put that together because, oh, the FBI and the CIA couldn't talk to each other because of the Jamie Gorelick wall, so let's have one department, everyone can talk. Well, you know something? I think, sir, it's about time, in the case of the Patriot Act, these three provisions, one of which I think is fine, and stuff, everything that was put in place after 9/11, for Congress especially, to start looking at it and thinking if these are still good ideas, because you know it's supposed to be the land of the free, and it feels like it's heading toward lockdown. Every step of the way, nobody, except for maybe even Rand Paul, and I'm still figuring out what I think of that guy because I'm not sure, wants to address these issues and have real debates about them. And even when it is time, they wait till the last second. The president, I guess, doesn't have a fax machine in Europe, so he has to AutoPen. So is there any appetite in D.C. for an actual debate about this Homeland Security Patriot Act stuff, or are they just going to keep, ad hocing us, right through?
Well, I'm afraid that maybe the latter. You raise the question that some of these provisions were passed in the wake of 2001, the September 11 attacks, and I think Congress separated out certain provisions that they had some doubts about for this continual reauthorization on purpose, because they didn't want to give carte blanche to the Bush administration to go ahead and do things forever and create a kind of permanent national security state with the ability to violate civil liberties, or in this case, taking away civil liberties, because they wouldn't be violations because they were lawful, right? And what happened was they said, these provisions really bother us, so we want the government to come back. And I think their hope was that, all of our hope was that terrorism would become a smaller threat, and we wouldn't have, when we came back in a more sober light of day, we'd look at these things and say, well, maybe necessary in an emergency, but not necessary now, and we'd reject the provisions. So this was by design, and then instead of taking that second shot or third shot to reflect on the rules and decide whether we still need them, as you said, the Congress decided to wave this through with a relatively minimal debate. So it's not encouraging. The only good thing is that reauthorization will come up again, and for people really concerned about the civil liberties, we really need to try to have that debate, not at the last minute, but throughout the next period while these things are in action, so that we can call out whether we need them in the future. Yeah,
well, of course they'll come up again, but what's the point of it coming up again if it's going to be the same move? And you know it will. They'll wait till midnight. You know, people hoped, as you said, that terrorism would be a less part of our life. Now, defenders of these sorts of provisions, sir, would say, well, it's because we have all these provisions and we've staved off terror attacks. Others, and it's a growing school of thought for which I have an increasing amount of respect, say, you know something? You know what the real threat is? It isn't actual terrorism. It's our response to terrorism, which creates and continues a police state until we get used to it. And that's what we live with. And that's what our kids and our grandkids are going to they're always going to be locked down, scanned, groped, everything. Or the government can subpoena your business records and find out who you're doing business with. Always. That's just always been the way it is. This is why the provision was put in place, as you said, sir. But you know something? If they don't debate it, I mean, it's only getting debated here on this program, really. If you don't debate it, then what's the point of having the renewal provisions for these?
Well, and it relates to something else that Congress has done that a lot of people have been talking about, which is the forced vote on an extension of the debt ceiling. In theory, the government can borrow money. Congress authorizes a bigger budget than the revenue that's coming in, and so, of course, the government borrows the balance, and that's a normal thing. Some years ago, the Congress decided they would create a law that required the Congress to authorize an increase in the amount of borrowing the government's allowed to do. Now, it's a bit of a show. It's not hugely important, except that what it does is it forces congressmen to go on record and say about the consequences of their spending authorization that, yes, the government is now going to borrow even more money, we're going to have even more debt. The idea was to force them to have a serious debate and really reflect on what they were doing. And yet we see the debt limit debate become a bit of a circus, and sometimes people just want to go ahead and just authorize it and say, well, look, it's automatic. I think Congress tries to discipline itself, but the quality of debate, the quality of reflection, the seriousness with which they take the nation's business really falls short.
Yeah, they discipline themselves on paper, it sounds like. But when push comes to shove, or when it's time to debate these things that were contemplated in the drafting of legislation, it doesn't actually happen. They do a quick vote right, before thing expires at midnight, signed by, R2-D2 pen, and it doesn't actually get taken care of. And then we got all kinds of provisions where automatically taxes go up or automatically borrowing goes up. And that's not government of the people, by the people, and for the people. I'm pretty sure I read that somewhere. Chris Sands, Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute, joining us from Washington, D.C. Thank you so much, sir, for being with us.
Thank you, Theo. Have a great weekend.
You too. And we'll be back with your market account on the Caldwell account. Return to us, please.